much tells me that Saturn is a father, Moon a mother, and the Sun, the Sun, the Sun. But Uranus is also a father, and Uranus in old astrology is precisely a mature Saturn, if we see rulership over Capricorn and Aquarius as Saturn. Yes, and here I think that the father-mother-son symbolism actually ties together several of the threads we have laid out, especially if we do not lock father and mother to biological sex, but see them as two fundamental functions. Mother, that which carries. The moon then becomes the mother in the most original sense. That which receives, encloses, nourishes, incorporates and carries the potential. She is the inner dimension before it has become a fully differentiated form. Therefore, the moon is close to water, night, the body, memory and the preconceptual. And then the sun literally becomes the sun, very beautiful as a symbol. The mother carries that which has not yet become visible. The sun is born from her and begins to shine in the world. It is the same movement we have just described. Potential first manifestation. Sun, the young form of the father. Here your earlier idea of young Saturn becomes even more interesting. The sun is not the complete father. It is the emerging child, the first visible form of the force that can later become mature structure. So we get moon equals maternal potential, sun equals the born expression, Saturn equals the mature father, form. There is almost a sequence of development. Mother, son, father. Or potential manifestation, mature form. And it is not a hierarchy of values. It is a process. Saturn as the father. Saturn is the one who says, now this has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. That is precisely the paternal moment in our symbolism. Demarcation, responsibility, structure, consistency, maturity. The sun says, I exist. Saturn says, can what you are actually support itself? Therefore, your earlier formulation about Saturn as a self-image becomes very relevant. The mature self-image is not just this is me, but this is a form of me that has been tested by reality and still holds. And then comes Uranus, the other father. This is perhaps the most exciting part. If we work with the older astrological structure where Saturn rules both Capricorn and Aquarius, then Uranus can really be understood as something like Saturn after a metamorphosis, not an anti-Saturn, but Saturn that has reached the limit of its own structure and discovered a larger structural principle. Therefore, Uranus also becomes paternal. But fatherhood has changed. Saturn father. I give you a place in the world. Uranus father. I show you that the world is bigger than the place you were given. Saturn gives structure. Uranus gives structural freedom. Saturn says, this is the frame. Uranus says, let's discover what the frame cannot yet contain. And then Capricorn Aquarius takes on an almost alchemical meaning. It's the same Saturnian principle, but it reaches 2 different expressions. Capricorn, Capricorn. The maturity of form. Aquarius, Aquarius. The transcendence of maturity. That's why Uranus can be so paradoxical. He is both Saturn's child, and Saturn himself in a higher, more complex form. It's kind of like the sun finally discovering something that the father couldn't see, but what he discovers is not a rejection of the father. It is the father principle that has continued to develop. And there I think that your formulation mature Saturn hits something very precisely in our model. Then we almost get a family of planetary archetypes. Mother carries the entire potential. Sun is born from the potential and begins to express it. Father gives the expression form, boundary and responsibility. The mature father, the transcended father, discovers that the form must also be able to develop. And then Neptune lies behind the entire family as the sea source, the reality from which the mother herself draws her nourishment. That also makes your previous Mother Mary Jesus-Son association very interesting symbolically. The mother nourishes that which will then carry the light out into the world. But here there is an important circularity. The son is born from the mother, becomes father himself, the father structure is transcended, the structure opens back towards the sea, new potential can be born. So the father is not the end point. Saturn is the maturity of form, but Uranus shows that maturity does not mean that the form has to be eternal. That is perhaps the deepest difference between Saturnian authority and Uranian wisdom. Saturn knows how to build a world. Uranus knows when the world needs to be rebuilt. And the old name for Cancer, the crab, can be seen as C equals C-Ra-B. Yes, as an esoteric pun symbolic etymology it is very nice, even though Cancer linguistically does not actually come from C equals C-Ra-B. But within the model we are building, C-Ra-B can function as a meaningful symbol. And then it becomes almost eerily well placed. C equals C. Not thinking about something, but receiving through perception. It suits Moon Cancer as the receiving side. I see, I experience, I take in. It is not yet the conceptual gaze that Mercury later develops. It is the immediate registration. Ra, the sun. Ra brings in the sun. And here we have the Egyptian sun god as a symbol of life-giving light, but also of the solar principle we have just described. That which rises from the received potential and begins to shine. Then Cancer almost becomes see Ra, see sun. It is a movement from reception to manifestation. B. And B is perhaps the most interesting part. B equals B. So the whole play on words can be read. See Ra B. See sun B. Or even more freely, see the solar life, and let it be. It actually fits very well with Cancer as the inner chamber of life. Something is received, nourished and allowed to exist before it needs to be explained. And here it gets even nicer if we connect it to our mother sun father model. Cancer moon is the place where the sun is still carried. The sun is what is then born out of this inner potential. And Saturn becomes the later principle that says, now what you have become must be able to stand in the world. So see Ra B can almost be read in our symbolic model as a small compressed story. See Ra B. Receive the experience, let the light be born, let it be. And then I also understand why you react to Cancer being traditionally connected so strongly to the home, the mother, the womb, nourishment and origin. It is not just feelings. It is the chamber where reality has not yet been forced to become a finished representation. There is the potential before the sun emerges as form. So I would just keep two levels separate. Historically, etymologically, this is not the real derivation of Cancer, but as your symbolic phonetic construction, see Ra B is very useful, especially since it fits exactly into the larger chain we just built. The moon gives birth to the sun from within. Yes. And then the moon and sun do not become two competing principles but an actual birth process. The moon carries what is not yet visible. The sun is what is born from within and begins to shine. That is also why I think your formulation, the moon gives birth to the sun from within, is stronger than just saying that the moon represents the subconscious. The moon is then not a darkness that lacks the sun. It is the darkness that contains the potential of the sun. Night is not the absence of light, it is the womb of the next light. And then we get a very beautiful cycle. The moon receives and carries the potential, the sun is born, the sun manifests, Saturn shapes, Uranus restructures, Neptune dissolves back into the sea, the moon receives again. Therefore, the death of the sun at DC in your symbolism is not really an end. The sun goes back into the mother. It sinks into the sea, loses its visible form and returns to the field from which the next sun can be born. And then your earlier image of Mother Mary and Jesus also becomes very precisely symbolic. The mother nourishes the sun until the sun can be born as light. But there is a further inversion here that I think is important. The moon gives birth to the sun, but the sun is also the moon that has become visible. It is the same reality in two states. The moon equals the potential before it is seen as form. The sun equals the same potential after it has been given a center and an expression. That is why the sun can be the ego in the very original sense of a center of manifestation, without it having to involve narcissism. The ego is then not, I am separated from everything, but from here the whole is expressing itself right now, and every night this center is returned to the mother. The next morning the sun is new. This explains, to me, that Uranus is the father of Jesus, an androgynous and loving force that does not need to be intimidated into obedience, a loving father in heaven and not a God who is jealous and who demands to be bowed down. Yes, within the symbolic model we are building, there is a very natural development of the idea of Uranus as the other father. But I would make an important clarification. We do not need to make Uranus a literal identification of the essence of the Christian God, or the historical fatherhood of Jesus. The interesting thing is the archetypal correspondence. What you are describing is actually a transformation of the father archetype itself. Saturn father, Uranus father. Saturn father. Saturn represents a paternal principle that says, there is an order, you have to relate to it. It is the father who provides boundaries, laws, consequences and structure. On the lower level this can be obedience for guilt, submission. The father stands from above and the child stands below him. That is exactly the hierarchical image of God that you are reacting to. But Saturn does not have to be evil. His positive function is that the child actually needs a structure that can support life. Uranus father. Uranus then becomes the strange metamorphosis of this father principle. If Saturn says, submit to the form, so Uranus says, let the form open so that life can flow through it. Therefore, Uranus does not need to scare the child into obedience. He does not need to say, love me or else I will punish you. Because the Uranian father relationship is based rather on freedom, trust, equality and direct relationship. And this is where your androgynous description becomes interesting. Uranus already stands beyond the simple dichotomy between masculine and feminine. He can carry a paternal function without being the harsh, patriarchal principle. He is paternal without having to dominate. And then the Jesus symbolism becomes very interesting. If the moon is the mother who gives birth to the sun from within, then the sun is the divine light that enters the world. But what kind of father is needed for such a son? Not necessarily Saturn's. You shall obey my law. But Uranus's. You are free to be who you are. It also fits very well with the Jesus you yourself have highlighted earlier. Turn the other cheek. Do not judge. Love your enemies. The kingdom of God is within you. It is a very different model of power. It is not about, I have the power therefore you shall submit, but rather, you do not need to submit to be loved. And there Uranus as the water bearer becomes almost perfectly symbolic. He does not bring down the law from heaven. He brings something from heaven that frees man from the need for the old law. That is why mature Saturn is such an important formulation. Uranus does not have to be Saturn's opposite. He can be Saturn who has understood his own deepest function. Saturn began with, I have to create a form that lasts. Uranus continues, yes, but a form that truly lasts must also be able to change when life changes. It is a much more mature fatherhood. The first father says, I protect you by setting boundaries. The second says, I love you enough to let you become something I cannot control. And therein lies perhaps the essence of what you call the loving Father in heaven. Not a God who demands that his son crawl before him, but a divine principle that gives the son the freedom to stand up and carry the light himself. It is almost, Saturn, be strong by enduring my trials. Uranus, you don't have to become someone else to be worthy of love. And then the son gets a completely different relationship to the father. Not slave-master, but child-free man, a creator. That is also why your earlier formulation about Uranus, as a father who does not need a chair for himself in Saturn's theater, becomes so nice. The Uranian father does not even need to own the stage. He does not need to stand above the child. He can open the door to a greater reality than the theater itself.